Hello, my name is James Sturm. I'm the director of the Center for Cartoon Studies. We put the CCS students in the front row to get a little enthusiasm here. I just want a couple things. I want to thank the Leslie Center for Humanities. This is the fourth year in a row that we've worked together to bring an exceptional talent here to the Upper Valley, and it's been a great partnership, so thanks for that. The Will and Ann Eisner Foundation also helped make this happen, so thanks to them. And now I'd like to introduce, I guess, cell phones off. Thanks for that reminder. I appreciate that, Kevin. So our guest was born on the island of Malta in the Mediterranean Sea. He returned for his Bachelor of Arts degree in journalism at the University of Oregon in 1981. And when you first hear about Joe Sacco's work, it sounds a little bit like a novelty act. He's a cartoonist. He's a journalist. And, let's look at them together. Isn't this interesting? And then as soon as you read one of his pieces, you realize he's not just a cartoonist and he's a journalist. He's an exceptional cartoonist and he's an exceptional journalist. And bringing these together, he makes something that's so unique and rare and touching and moving. His books include Palestine, Safe Area, on my right side, GarageNet, thank you very much. I'm getting flustered up here. He's been a recipient of the Guggen Fellowship. I won't even bother to describe his work. I'm sure we'll be seeing some slides anyway. His most recent work is Footnotes in Gaza, and he revisits an atrocity of the past that allows for a broader, more nuanced and humane perspective on the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I'm so pleased and honored to welcome Joe Sacco.
I think. Okay, well, thanks for the introduction, James, and thanks to Dartmouth and the Leslie Center and to the Center for Cartooning Studies? Okay, for Cartoon Studies. All right, well, thanks to everyone. And as you can see, this has probably been impressed into your skull now for the last 30 minutes. This lecture is entitled Comics as Journalism. And I guess I don't need to stand up while I show these slides, but I'm just going to hit the lights, and Steve's going to hit the lights here, and we're just going to begin. Okay, you probably all know this particular image. It is the national, the chief of police for the Republic of Vietnam. He was the major police official in Vietnam during the Tet Offensive in 1968. And it shows him shooting a Viet Cong suspect, on the street, a summary execution, clearly. And it's a photograph that really, it helped galvanize, it's one of those images that really helped galvanize America against the war. And I think all of you know this image. And it was taken by a photographer named Eddie Harris, who really rightly won a Pulitzer Prize for this. And no pun intended, but this is the perfect shot. It's taken at that mortal moment. And a photographer, through skill and luck, they managed to capture something like this. Now, the back end of that story is that maybe he was taken out and shot because the photographer was there and he wanted to make a point. But leaving that aside, Eddie Harris got the Pulitzer Prize for this amazing photograph. Here's another perfect shot, and this is a painting, and it's Goya's painting, The 3rd of May. And during the Napoleonic Wars, the French troops marched into Spain, and there was an uprising at some point, and French soldiers rounded up Spanish men, and in retaliation for the uprising, shot them down. And like I said, it's sort of perfectly constructed in this way. You have the dead already, the about to be shot, and the ones being led up to their execution. And so now here are those two images together. And obviously there are differences. One is a photograph, one's a painting. But I'd say the major difference is one of intent. Eddie Harris, the photographer, regretted taking his picture. He referred to the general as fighting a just a just cause, for a just cause. And on Ollie North's TV program many years later, he called the general a goddamn hero. He regretted taking this picture and what the impact it had on the general's life. The general later moved to the United States, and he was always sort of hounded by this image that Eddie Harris took. And this is something that Eddie Harris said or wrote, I'm not sure which. Still photographs are the most powerful weapon in the world. People believe them, but photographs do lie, even without manipulation. They are only half-truths. What the photograph didn't say was, what would you do if you were the general at the time and place on that hot day, and you caught the so-called bad guy after he blew away 1, 2, or 3 American people? Now, what can we say about Goya? He didn't regret his picture. The thing about painting or drawing is everything is really deliberate. He deliberately wanted to show the French soldiers, or not show their faces, just show them as sort of a organic collection of people that sort of blend in together, and all you can see is their backs, their haversacks, their shackos, and their rifles. Whereas now look at the victims. You see faces, you see fear. The guy with the white shirt, I mean, clearly unarmed, opening himself up to this death. You don't know if he's in despair or not, but you really focus on the victims. He had every intent of making the viewer of this painting feel those things. I think that's pretty true. And I think any sort of narrative art form, and I would say the bottom painting is a narrative piece of work because you see people shot, people being shot, and people about to be shot. There's sort of a story going on there. Every narrative piece of drawing or painting, I think, is really deliberate and has intent. I've got the wrong device I'm holding. All right. Now, my work is pretty deliberate, and it's deliberate especially in the sense of where I choose to go and what I choose to report on. I'm lucky enough to be independent, so my interests are people who've been dispossessed, people who've been sort of swept under the rug of history. And here are some examples of some people I've met along the way. You know, like a woman in Gaza on the left, a child in Bosnia on the right. On the top, African migrants who've taken boats to get to Europe and are in a detention facility. This was on the island of Malta where I did a story about that. And then in the bottom, Indian women in India, in Kushinagar, who weren't just poor, but they were malnourished and hungry. So those are the people that have sort of interested me, and obviously that's a very I make deliberate choices. Now that's me in the middle. I'm a figure in my comics work, in my journalism work, and this is something that wasn't quite deliberate, but it was sort of a fortuitous coming together of events or ways of doing things. I started doing comics in the middle of the 80s, and there was a sort of a tradition which still exists of autobiographical comics. So there were stories about my love life and all that kind of stuff. And I was also interested in political stuff, so when I finally did something and went to a place like the Palestinian territories, it was an easy stretch to think of myself as doing sort of an autobiographical comic of my experiences among the Palestinians. It just so happens that I studied journalism, and almost organically, I began to think of this story as a journalistic story, and I began to take notes, figure out how to put the story together. I found that over time, I realized this accidental bringing together of the first-person narrative and journalism has real value. And the main thing is I basically let the reader know by my presence that this is a subjective piece of work. And as much as I feel very beholden to the truth, I have my own viewpoints. I'm not pretending that I'm a completely neutral observer. What I try to do is look at the people I'm meeting, ostensibly the victims, as real human beings. Sometimes the victims aren't, angels, and you have to show that sort of thing. But having myself is like the first-person singular walking around. The pronoun I is walking around. So every time you see me, it's a reminder. This is subjective. You're seeing this story through someone's eyes. There are other reasons for having yourself in the story, and one of them is, I think journalists in these places, conflict zones, whatever, often have experiences that they cut out of the story. It's very hard to include stories like I'll relate to you here. This is from my book, Safe Area Gorazda. And Gorazda was a town in eastern Bosnia that had been surrounded by the Bosnian Serbs for 3.5 years, very heavily shelled, and the people couldn't get out. It was under siege. I could get in because I had a press card, and at the very end of the war, the Serbs began to allow UN convoys to get in. And so with the press card, I was coming and going. And people noticed that, so they began giving me packages and letters to take to their relatives in Sarajevo, another city under siege, but that I could go back and forth between because they hadn't seen these people in 3.5 years. For example, my friend Ricky, on the top left with his parents, they gave me a box to give to his sister, their daughter, who had had a baby who they'd never seen in Sarajevo. So, I looked her up in Sarajevo and gave her the package. The soldier at the bottom, he hadn't seen his wife or children in Sarajevo for 3.5 years. He gave me a letter, and he said, find her. And I was searching around Sarajevo, not just this package and this letter, but many packages and letters. And he said something like, when he gave me the letter to give to her, he said, tell her there's plenty of chopped wood. Tell her I look good. These are very poignant scenes, and they bring something into relief about people in this situation. It would be very hard to tell a story like this, I think, and leave yourself out of it. I didn't want to say the soldier gave a letter to this reporter, or a reporter. It just seemed a little false to do something like that. And another advantage, I think, of using the first person in journalism, which you can do pretty easily in comics, is you can explore your prejudices. I personally have a hard time believing that any American journalist that goes to the Middle East or some very strange, by Western standards, locale is going to leave his or her prejudices at the airport. I think people bring their prejudices with them, as I did. And I tried to demonstrate this. This was a chapter in my book, Palestine, called Hijab. It's the costume the women wear that allows only their face and their hands to be shown. Now, I saw these women all over the place, but I could no longer pay attention to them as individuals. As I write in the caption here, I don't know if you can read it, they seemed like pigeons on the street to me. I was so used to ignoring them completely because of this uniform. Then one day, in a taxi, a woman wearing a hijab turned to me and just sort of out of the blue started asking me questions in perfect English about, what did I think of Nablus? What had I seen? How is it going? What are my impressions? And it was kind of a shock to me because I didn't know this pigeon could talk. But clearly she was an individual under all this, and I think that brings something into relief about a Westerner's prejudices there. And by putting myself in the story, it's something I can convey. Now, if I had to say the one thing that I think that the marriage of comics and journalism can bring to a reader is taking the reader viscerally to a time or to a place. This is the town of Gorazda in 1995 when I was there. I read about Gorazda a couple of years before I got there. There was a great New York Times journalist named John Burns who had actually walked over the mountains to sort of personally break the siege with some other people, and he got into the town and wrote these very evocative stories about the people in Gorazda. What he didn't describe, because recently I looked over some of his articles, he didn't describe what the town looked like. So when I got there the first time on a UN convoy, I had no clue of what this place looked like. I didn't know there were multi-story apartment buildings or anything like that. And there were bigger buildings than even I'm showing you here. So what I think I can do with an image is fill in that blank and engage the reader even more by putting him or her in the street with these people. And you know, comics you can be very informational. You can convey a lot of information with drawings. For example, people chopping wood because there was no other fuel for heat. And you know, people with wheelbarrows and even horses to haul things around because there was no petrol and only maybe 8 cars were allowed petrol in a town that had about 57,000 people in it. So this is something, you know, I can try to let the reader know just by looking at these images. Now that was a big panorama, you know, sort of Goya-esque moment, but the real strength of comics is the fact that you have sequential images and you can build something up. This is another time and a place. This is during the first Intifada in Jabalia refugee camp in the Gaza Strip. And I'm walking with the guy who had invited me to stay with him and became my guide by the Israeli, at the time the Israelis were still there, by their watchtower. Now, none of these drawings as individual drawings are that spectacular, but they cumulatively add a lot of information, I think, or make a point. And the point I wanted the background to really matter here. I wanted the mud that followed us around to follow the reader around. Now, how would a prose writer write this? He would say, Jabalia refugee camp has streets, washed out streets with mud everywhere. But a prose writer is not going to cap every sentence about Jabalia refugee camp with that particular imagery. It would be ludicrous to keep saying, oh, and by the way, it's muddy, by the way, it's muddy. With comics, every scene in the background, no matter what's going on as far as the captions and the narration is concerned, every scene in the background can convey that and give the reader that feeling so that the mud's following them around. And I think that builds up a sense of atmosphere of a place. Now, the other thing comics can do, and pretty seamlessly, I think, is take a reader from the present to the past. On the right, this is Rafah refugee camp in 2003 when I was there, much as I remembered it. On the left, Rafah refugee camp in 1956, which I have never seen. If you look at this, I've got this laser I'll use. Okay, if you look at this building here and this building here, they're actually the same building, but in the intervening years, they had nowhere to build because of the confines of the place, and it abutted settlements and the Gaza border, the Egyptian border. They had no place to build but up and into the street. So you have like these little back alleys. And these pages were relatively consecutive, so a reader could get that idea that this is actually the same scene and there's about 50 years between them. Now, how did I get a view of 1956? Well, I went to there was a United Nations Relief and Works Agency, is the UN agency that works with Palestinian refugees. And they have an archive in Gaza City, so I went to their photo archive, and they gave me a lot of photographs of what the refugee camps looked like from the late 40s all the way to the present day, with many from the 50s. So this is another time and another place. This is Chechnya in the mid-40s, or the early 40s, during World War II. And I was in Ingushetia, which is the neighboring republic to Chechnya, where a lot of Chechen refugees were because of the war that was going on. This was in 2002. I was there. And I spoke to an older Chechen woman, a number of older Chechen women, because the story was actually about Chechen women. And they were describing what happened when the Soviets came, and they took every living Chechen and Ingush person, put them on trains, and took them about 1,000 miles away to Kazakhstan and even further away to Siberia. The Chechens had really resisted Soviet collectivization in the 20s, and I suppose Stalin was worried about what the Chechens would do with the Germans approaching during World War II. Now, it turns out a lot of Chechens fought in the Soviet army, but that didn't seem to matter to Stalin. Anyway, the woman described how she was a child and how the the children were taken by the wrist and just thrown into carts, and often they weren't even dressed, the kids. And they shot, the Soviets shot the horses, and they put them all in the trains. Now, a prose writer, luckily for the prose writer, just has to say that. You know, they shot the horses, and they forced people into the trains. If you're a cartoonist, you've got to fill that information in, and you have to be as authentic as possible. So obviously you have to research what Soviet uniforms were like during the war, their rifles, their Tommy guns, what the trains were like at that time. You know, I'm trying for something, it's not necessarily the literal truth. I mean, none of these images, it's all interpretive. It's, you know, drawing is interpretive, and I am a filter, but I'm trying to get to something essential about this scene, even though it took place in the past. Now, you know, I have the pretense of saying what I do is journalism, and often I'm quoting people directly. And this is from my latest book, Footnotes in Gaza, and it's about a man. It's about one long part of the book is about what happened in Rafah in 1956, when Israeli soldiers were screening for Palestinian guerrillas, and they asked, or they commanded all military-age men, which would be about 15 or 16 and up, to gather in the school so they could screen them. And this man, like many men that I interviewed, gave me a quote which I taped, and that is an accurate quote. So far there's nothing different between what a journalist does, a prose journalist does, and what I've done. I mean, maybe I've drawn a picture of him, but that's a pretty accurate picture from a photo. But now I'm taking those accurate words, the journalism, and putting it on an image that I'm concocting from the past. Now, it's not made out of whole cloth. That scene I'm showing you is based on many interviews I did. It's based on descriptions of what the school wall looked like. It's based on what the Israeli army uniforms looked like and all that. But it is interpretive. So there's always going to be, when you're doing comics as journalism, this inherent tension between the accuracy of what you're reporting, the quotes, and the interpretive nature of the drawing. I can't get around it. But I am trying for some level of truth. It's more an essential truth than a literal truth when I'm going back to scenes like that. But then we have scenes that I've actually witnessed. And so how do I put something like that together? This is also from the book Footnotes in Gaza. And it's right along the Egyptian border. That's, if you see that wall in the background on the, I'll use my laser, this wall here. And you see that this machine is an Israeli machine that was drilling holes into the ground and placing bombs, and they would blow these things up because they were trying to collapse tunnels that the Palestinians had dug into Egypt. These tunnels, as you know, they still exist, and things are smuggled in. And up here, you can see a bulldozer, and here too. And the Israelis were, what they claimed they were doing was demolishing homes from which tunnels were leading into Egypt, or from which they'd received fire, like a gunfire. I mean, that's pretty questionable. There were, when I was there, maybe 800 or so homes that had already been demolished along the border, and they just seemed to be in rows. I mean, it's not like you saw one house sitting out there that, you know, no, that there was no activity from there. They were just demolishing in rows. Or that was how I felt. I thought was going on. In any case, I was watching this scene. I'm on the bottom left here. There were some camera people there, some journalists. And there were some kids, Palestinian kids, always attracted to a disturbance and playing around, horsing around. And then a Israeli vehicle, armored vehicle, came at us, and we all ran, except for a photographer, a photojournalist who just stood his ground like any good photojournalist should while the cartoonist runs. And some kid who got sort of trapped out on the ridge, he hadn't moved fast enough, and we didn't bother to find out what happened to them. And we just kept running. And I'm not showing all the pages here, but we ran around some buildings, which I show. We get to this point, a lot of little scenes happened. It was it was almost like a little circus. There was a woman who really became hysterical, and then a guy with a camera pointed to her, and she became hysterical, sort of almost on cue. And there were some cameramen, and then a guy came up to the cameramen and photographers and said, don't shoot pictures of my home. Because if the Israelis were going to destroy homes from which gunmen were firing from, and there were some gunmen firing near his home, he didn't want the Israelis to see that image and then to demolish his home. And then, no matter what was going on, he strode across an open field and just started yelling in those top panels, yelling at the gunmen, get away from my home. And suddenly this group of international solidarity movement people, these activists showed up with a banner to say, stop the demolitions. All the stuff was going on, and it was pretty wild. And the bottom scene is what I want to show you, though. It's, I don't know if these little figures here, that's me and my friend. We ran from here this way to get to here, this wall here. You can still see there's a bulldozer here. There's that digger and that armored vehicle there. Here are the solidarity people. Here are the gunmen. So what level of accuracy am I trying to get here? I mean, I will not vouch for every bush and every brick. But this is Block J in the Rafah refugee camp. And I'm pretty certain that anyone who knows that neighborhood would know those buildings, would probably know, oh yeah, I know who lives in that one. Yes, there's that little mosque. There's so-and-so's building. That's the level I'm trying to get at with things I witness, if at all possible. I'm trying to get to that kind of accuracy. It doesn't always work out that way, but I do try. In the evenings I come home, I told some students this today at the cartoon school. I told them about how I keep a religious journal. Here's a couple of pages from where I wrote about that scene in my scrawl. And obviously I'm being very descriptive in my writing to remind myself about this scene, because I know that 2 or 3 years from that moment, I'm going to be drawing this scene. It's a long book. It's going to take me a long time to get to that scene. So I better have as much information as possible to jog my memory. So you'll see that like there's a map here. It's a little map. There's a bigger map here showing where we ran from here down to this field. There's a mosque I label. There was a big ridge here with where the tank went or the vehicle went. And we ran around this way. And then on the next page, I have another map to show how we further ran around. So I have that. And then at the time, I was taking pictures. Now, these don't look like action pictures because I'm just not an action photographer. These are pictures taken at the time of the buildings. Here you'll see the International Solidarity people. And the gunmen had been standing here. They'd moved on by then. This is a muddy road we ran across. This is a building that was receiving fire as we sat around here. And I had many pictures I took then. And then a couple of days later, 2 or 3 days later, I came back to the scene and took pictures again of different buildings and the scene, just so I could recreate that whole thing. And then putting those things together, I can get an image like that bottom image. I mean, I can use the photographs, the maps, and make it look pretty accurate, I think. So that was a pretty representational series of, scene where I'm trying to draw relatively realistically to the best of my abilities. This is a scene where I'm being a little more cartoony. It's taking the reader to another time and place. This is Club Obola in 1995 in Sarajevo. And it was kind of like the center of the universe, so that's what it felt like. The front line was about 200 or 300 meters away. And soldiers, they were young soldiers in their early 20s or late teens, they'd get off the front line and they'd walk straight to the club to meet their girlfriends. And at this club, they had the most current music. It would be really loud. And it was just a tremendous scene in there. I mean, girls hanging off their cigarettes, ignoring guys, guys singing at the top of their lungs, playing air guitar, and headbanging. Now, I could have tried to draw this in a more representational way, but I don't think it would have cut it. So, here's, this is another panel further on the story where they're really headbanging here. Now, this is very cartoony, but what I think it does is it really gives the reader a sense of the ferocity that they were doing this. I mean, this was, if they had hit their heads, they would have burst their heads open. I mean, they were really going for it. Now, I really wanted to convey that. Is that journalism? I mean, I would say it is because I am trying to give the reader a real sense of the atmosphere. It's not traditional journalism, but I really think it helps take the reader there. And comics is very fluid. You can be representational, you can be cartoony, you know, to very specific ends, and hopefully for the good of the story. Now, the last little section is about words and how to use them, and this is a slide, how not to use them. For all the cartooning students here, I've been accused of using too many words in my comics, and this is a good demonstration. This is from a story called Christmas with Karadzic, where I was with some other journalists, and we went to try to find Radovan Karadzic, who is leader of the Bosnian Serbs and who is now in The Hague. Okay, here's, now I began, you know, I feel like I know how to use words and how they can enhance an illustration. I mean the physical placement of the words. It's something I think cartoonists should think about. This is from the book Palestine. And it's a story a 15-year-old guy told me about how he'd been shot in a clash with Israeli soldiers. And then the Israeli soldiers went looking for the wounded in the hospital and beat them further and beat hospital members. So he was relating the scene to me, very violent scene. And I was wondering, how am I going to put the words on this? I mean, the images give so much, but I do want to show that it was sort of a quote. So I want the words here. I wanted to sort of give a feeling of the speed of events. And so I came up with this idea of, I'll let a whole line run the entire length of the page, and then another line along the length of the page, and another line along the length of the page, because that interrupts the reader's eye flow as little as possible. And I didn't want a lot of line breaks. And I even broke the line in between the second and the third line. I broke it right in the middle of a sentence so that the reader feels sort of compelled to go to the next word and not really pay attention to the images. I want this to be read in a fast way so that the images are almost peripheral on first reading. So they can sort of see out of the periphery of their eye this violent action. Anyway, that's the intent. Now, obviously with comics, a reader can stop and examine it at his or her leisure, but you can do a lot with movement and with timing in comics. And this should be an example of timing. There are no words on this page, but it's actually meant to be read slowly. Sometimes an image with no words is read more slowly than an image with words. Words kind of make you go down a page. But if you look at something like this, I think the reader wants to look at this and sort of soak it up a bit. This is from the book The Fixer. And it was about, I mean, part of the story takes place in my very first few hours in Sarajevo when I didn't know what I was doing. And all I knew was journalists go to the Holiday Inn. That's where you can get a room. And then when I got there and found out the price of a room, I thought, 10 days here and I'm going home. But I knew the Holiday Inn was right on Sniper Alley, and I knew it was close to the front line. And someone pointed to me the way to get down there. And I knew he wasn't going to point me in any way that there'd be a line of sight so anyone could see me walking down there. But it was a very eerie feeling. You know, you're walking into silence, and you're walking into a completely vacant area. And I can't remember if in my script, I described this scene, but clearly when I was drawing, the idea of having words in this just was, I knew that would ruin the whole effect. What I want is the reader to feel that. There's no need to tell the reader to feel that. The reader can look at something like this, and I hopefully will get that sense of silence. And of course, if you add one word there, the silence is broken. Okay, here's a case when I'm trying to use the placement of the words and how I'm putting those words to really enhance the action on the page. This was in Ramallah during the first Intifada. It's from the book Palestine. And some kids were confronting some Israeli soldiers and throwing rocks. They were running really quickly, throwing rocks and then running away. There was a sound of machine gun fire. No one was hurt. The panels, the way I put the panels together, are really meant to convey the frantic pace of this. Things like this happen really quickly. And I didn't want to use sort of this box panel to convey that. I think that would have just made it really leaden. So I put panels at these various angles. And if you notice, where the action kind of starts, at the first small panel, where it says automatic fire, soldiers, all that's sort of in focus. The car is in focus. The graffiti in the back is in focus. Then when they're running, the background is sort of immaterial. It's all out of focus. I want you to look at the people, because some people were running and some people had already thrown their stones and were running back. All this seemed to be going on at once. And I think, if you have a camera, you're looking at something. You're looking, the lens is looking at something. With a lot of images on a page, you can create a certain simultaneity where it felt like everything was going on at once. You can convey that, perhaps, that everything is going on at once. The words are placed in a way sort of to lead the reader's eye, but to sort of give it this confused feeling, like you're not 100% sure which way you should read it. And the words are very clipped. The phrases are clipped, which is a technique I got from Ferdinand Céline, who I was really enamored with when I was in my early 20s, because he had these clipped phrases that sort of kept making the point over and over again and had this rhythm. And some of these words are there's even a one-word caption here. So I'm trying to create this sort of frantic, really frantic scene. And now, is that journalism? I mean, I'm trying to give a reader a sense of what it felt like. I mean, a camera person can have a handheld. I mean, they use that technique. I don't have the pretense of a handheld camera that's running down the street that makes you feel like you're there. Is that a pretense or not? I'm using what I have to give the reader a feeling. I think it's more important than just saying they met some soldiers and threw some rocks. And I think I have one more slide. Oh, it's this one. The image I showed you was words working with the pictures. This is words working against the pictures. This is in Sarajevo at the very end of the war. And in fact, the war the peace treaty had just been signed in Dayton, Ohio. And in Club Obala, all the kids were kind of excited because there were all these rumors going around about pop stars coming to Sarajevo to play a concert. And the only one who came was Bono, by the way. But the captions read, "Peace and rumors of peace. Michael Jackson's coming, Janet Jackson, Rod Stewart. No, Paul McCartney and Eric Clapton. They're in Italy waiting for a plane. George Michael, Sting. Everyone is coming. There's going to be a knockout end-of-the-war concert in Sarajevo." That's what people really believed. I mean, these rumors were just flying around. Then you go onto the street, and what you see is people still living in bombed-out homes. You see people begging on the street, and always those sad scenes of older, middle-aged men who'd been conscripted into the army wearing an army jacket and running shoes, like in this case, and like something I would see, like an older man on a child's bicycle. It's very melancholic. And what I saw on the street was that, the war is over and people are obviously greatly relieved, but you could tell people's lives had been shattered. Now, a prose writer can write that. A prose writer can do a good job of saying there were rumors about a pop concert. Some people were very excited on the street. It was clear that it would be a great effort to get lives back in order. People had seen war, and now they were at the end of something really exhausting. A prose writer would have done that and made his point. With comics, by putting the images going one way, the words going another way, I want the reader to make that point. The reader makes that connection. I'm not telling the reader, look at this ironic juxtaposition. The reader is going to make that ironic, or whatever it is, juxtaposition. And I think that's the power of it. So clearly I'm interpreting. I'm trying to be accurate in the way I tell stories and in my quotes and everything like that. But I think once you pick up a pen and you're drawing, you are interpreting. Hopefully it's a very deliberate act, and you try to know what you're doing with it. And that's the end of that part of the presentation, and I guess we can take questions. So if we can hit the lights. Oh. Thank you. I'll stand up for this part. You won't see me if I'm sitting down. Anyone have any questions? Yeah.
How did, I know you talked about how you took pictures and tried to find out the history of a particular place, but how can you recreate those? I mean, there's only so many pictures I think you can take, but you recreate the situations in such detail. Do you have like photographic memory or?
No. I mean, I sort of feel like I have a memory, a visual memory that lasts about a year or two, where I can still draw things almost from memory. But after that, I really need the photographs, and I need, I think I told some students yesterday, I will often in my journal, I would write down reminders to myself, remember to draw kids, because kids are always in the background. That's like the mud that follows us around. The kids were following us around, so it was always in the background. I took a lot of photographs. I mean, if you saw my photographs, they're boring. You know, oh, that's your trip to the Gaza Strip, picture of that building. But I'm not thinking of that as a real record. The real record is the drawings to me. All that is for reference. I try to accumulate as much information as I can, whether it's past, stuff about the past, or what I've seen myself. You know, I mean, if there's a generic street scene, I'm not going to try to. I don't want to be like a photorealist that thinks that every single scene has to be exactly as it was. I mean, you might as well just take a photograph. But if it's a generic street scene, I'm just going to give you the feeling for it. Again, the essential truth, not necessarily the literal truth with stuff like that. It would be, I think, impossible. I spent 7 years on the book. I didn't want to spend 70 years on the book. Yeah.
Do you ever have a hard time, like, separating your thoughts from being in a moment versus in your narrative or your journalistic brain of, like, oh, that thing happened, that's going to be great for the book, instead of, oh my gosh, this thing happened, I'm reacting to it?
Did everyone hear the question? Mostly, you know, it's funny. I think anyone who's studied journalism, anyone who's worked as a journalist, looks for the quote. I mean, when someone says something, you think, oh, that's the quote. A light goes off in your head, and you realize that's it. And you almost want to kiss the person on the face and say, goodbye, I'm done. But you might get a better quote, so you stick around. You definitely feel like you are. It doesn't always occur to you at the time. Sometimes it's by going over your notes that it becomes apparent. And a lot, when I'm transcribing my tapes, I get a lot. It's one of the reasons I transcribe myself is so I can go over, hear those voices again, and remember that emotion. Someone might have said something, and it reminds me of how I reacted at the time. Often, I do react sometimes emotionally to what's going on, but generally speaking, I'm pretty cold. I mean, it's like I'm trying to be careful with the person's psyche, because often it's very loaded sort of stuff, but I'm trying to steer that person to my ends. I'm trying to find out about what happened on a particular day in 1956. If you're going to start talking about 1967, I have to haul you back to 1956. There's always this corralling of the person to where you want them to go. I mean, it's a manipulative process. Often people know to do that. They understand what you want. Often they're not used to. Some people have never told their story. They don't know how to tell it. They're starting at one end, and the next moment they're at the other end of it, and you try to hold them back. Yeah.
Obviously, differences between races, physically and socially, is something that you're forced to engage with in your work, and I'm curious if that is something that you engage with do you have a process or techniques that you use to deal with that? Is it an unconscious thing? You just draw what you see and don't think about how you're depicting different races or what methods you use?
I have to think about that. I mean, recently I drew Africans, and I was drawing Indians, and they're brown or much darker skin. And I'm not really happy with the way I came up with just drawing these parallel lines that sort of give them a shading. I wasn't confident. I tried other techniques. I think Robert Crumb knows how to do it. He can draw an African American with black and white without a wash. I didn't want to ape someone like him. I tried to come up with my own ways. Like I say, I'm not entirely happy with it, but it works okay. But I'm always sort of looking at it going, maybe I'll come up with something else at some other time. Yeah.
So you're really careful in your journalism just to include yourself as a character, so the reader automatically knows that it's a subjective account, and just you have a journalistic commitment to trying to get at an objective truth, and the politics involved with objective versus subjective. And so what are your thoughts on the politics of teaching history, since that's like accrued journalism?
Teaching history. Well, I mean, the fact that Howard Zinn had a book, People's History of America or of Europe or whatever it was, I think it was America, I mean, just shows that, just from the title, it's clear that we often don't get that. I mean, like I said, I'm choosing my subjects. And I sort of, on some level, I chose them. There was a certain accidental quality to it, because when I was first doing a lot of this stuff, I didn't have a press card, or I managed to get one by the skin of my teeth, but I had no backing of any major journalistic institution. So a general or a politician was not going to waste his time on me. And frankly, especially at the beginning, I wasn't confident enough to approach those people. So I just naturally gravitated to people in cafes and people on the street. I think all for the good, ultimately. You know, I think I might have brought this up earlier today, but look what happened in Egypt. All we used to hear about was Mubarak, and that's all we ever hear about, Mubarak. And then you realize, oh, there's an Egyptian people who actually took things into their own hands. They'd been sold short because journalists don't really get into the street to find out what people are thinking. It might be difficult because you have Egyptian security people following you around and everything, but I don't think it's impossible. And that became my intent. Okay, I could talk to some fanatic Hamas person who's going to be lurid and be good copy. I could talk to a politician who's going to spin it every which way, but it's the people's stories that I think matter. And I'm not sure how you teach history. Clearly, you have to teach a broad historical narrative with the so-called players. But in my mind, it's people that are affected by history. It's people who are expelled from their land, who suddenly, I mean, they find themselves homeless and when they're in their 50s, or they're just poor because of corruption and things like that. Those are the people I'm kind of interested in. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess it's up to the historian then to make a choice of what they teach or what they study. I realize there are often not a lot of source material on what average people were doing in the 1300s, for example. That's hard work to get to that sort of stuff. Yes?
Thinking about Susan Sontag's work, especially, she has a book regarding the pain of others, where she writes about the photography that's portraying deep suffering of other human beings, usually in other parts of the world, but not always. And she says, no one has the right to look at those photographs unless they are going to take on the responsibility to do something that can change it. And I wonder, first of all, if you agree with that, and second of all, do you hang on to any intention for how your works will touch people and how they'll change people? Or do you just, as an artist, have to let go of that and say, I've expressed myself and I just have to let go of what happens now?
Well, the events themselves definitely touched me and affected me. Often when I'm drawing it touches me and affects me sometimes more than when I'm actually there in a strange way. I feel that if those events affected me, I have pretty ordinary sensibilities and they will probably affect a reader. So I let that sort itself out. As far as the responsibility, I mean, I just read her book. As far as the responsibility, I do feel that if you put yourself in that situation, you have to take it, you You have to really be clear about what you're doing and why you're there. It is not about you. I mean, I'm a figure in my comics, but it has to serve an end. And I feel like I don't want to trouble people. People are telling you stories, and often they're crying and telling you these stories. You better tell this story right. I do feel an incredible responsibility to get it right. That's the short answer to that. That's actually a very long question. And it's something I think about a lot because I see other journalists and how they react, and then I see a lot of people in NGOs and how they react, and I've seen people breaking down. And then you realize, oh, actually you can no longer be effective. You're so moved, you can no longer be effective. You've got to keep some emotional distance, or else it's no point you being there. You'll just collapse, and you've got nothing to show for it. Yeah.
Obviously, for reasons of brevity and narrative, you can't include everything that you would want to. Is there anything reoccurring that you would like to include, but for a valid reason don't?
No, I think though I've gone on record as being a bit loose about talking about objectivity. I'm pretty subjective in my approach as far as my subject matter. I feel it's pretty important to be very honest about the people you're depicting. So let's say I'm sympathetic. Okay, I'm sympathetic to the Palestinians. I don't have a problem with that. Other people might. But it doesn't mean that Palestinians are always angels. They do things that I certainly don't like, and I heard things said that I felt, oh, this is not going to look good in the book, but I heard it from you, I heard it from that guy, I heard it from this guy, and it's going to end up in the book. So I have my greater truth is very important to me. I've decided I want to give the Palestinians a voice. Some of those voices are not going to sound good. There are certain stories that I'd love to get back to. Like I spent a lot of time on the Serb side of the lines during the Bosnian War. I got to meet people really well, and I heard some amazing things. I have a very good story in there. I don't know if I'll ever get to it. It's not because I don't think it's worthwhile. In fact, I think it's very worthwhile. It's just, creatively speaking, you kind of don't want to revisit stuff, and you want to move on, and you just have other ideas. Maybe one day I'll get to it. Yeah.
Unlike other forms of journalism, it seems like with comics, especially for kind of a craftsman as meticulous as you, so much time and weight goes into what you actually end up producing. So how do you make a decision of where you want to go and what you want to focus on?
Knowing on what to focus on, comics take so long. That's probably one of the most important decisions you can make. You always have to project yourself into the future and say, 2 or 3 years from now, will I still think this was the right decision? And I might have mentioned this to the students at the cartoon school, but there's always a mid-project crisis I'll go through when I think, oh, do I really want to do this? And of course I have to do it because I've started it. But then I have to listen to who I was 2 or 3 years earlier and say, that person made a decision, and I have to just trust that person. That person's the boss. But that person knows what he's dealing with. He's dealing with a lot of time in someone's life. And like I said, and comics take a long time to do. When you get to be a certain age, you really begin to think about it a lot. Like, how many more books do I have left in me? What are the subjects I want to take on? I have to be very deliberate. Anyone from over here? Okay. In the back?
And part of that deliberation seems to me to be deciding to do the work in the kind of detail that you do it. And you could deliberate and say, I'm going to make more sketchy kinds of things that will take me less time, but I may be able to tell more stories. But you've not gone that direction. You've gone for the big detail,
Yeah, sometimes I regret it. Sometimes I think that way, and sometimes I wish I drew in a different way. And then I'll try to force myself to draw in some other way, and it just doesn't work. You get older, and it's like it just comes out of your hand. Hatching comes out of my hand. If it would be very difficult to sort of consciously change your work. I think it might be different for different people, but for me, it would have to be a very organic process. And it's clear to me that people can evoke something without being so detailed. I think Marjane Satrapi doesn't need that level of detail to give the reader a sense of what was going on in Tehran. I'm really wedded to detail. Partly it's because I think it really makes a place particular. Gorazda was not Sarajevo, it wasn't Bihać, it wasn't Banja Luka. It was Gorazda. It looked like that. I want someone from Gorazda to look at that and say, yes, that's correct. So, and I think it's important to do that because it helps distinguish that story from some other story. And all the little details, I think, engage the reader. You can see how people live. You can see what's on their walls, what their carpets are like. I hate drawing carpets. I've promised myself I'd never draw another market scene as long as I live, but you end up doing it because it's the right thing to do at that moment. You've got to let the work be the commander. Once you've decided to embark on that thing, you can't sort of go back on it. Yeah.
Can you tell us what you're working on now?
Well, the journalism thing I'm working on, and in some ways I want to move away from journalism. But the journalism thing I'm working on now is with a writer named Chris Hedges. And he's doing a lot of the prose, and we're sharing interviews. Actually, he does a lot of the interviewing, and I'm there and just chip in questions. He's a really good journalist. And it's great. I really learn a lot listening to him and how he asks questions. But it's about post-industrial America. And we've already visited Camden, New Jersey, and we visited southern West Virginia, where coal mining companies have done a lot of mountaintop removal and just taken the resources and left barren places that are just falling apart. So that's the story we're working on. We still have to figure out another couple of places to go to. And we're going back to Camden and to West Virginia in a month or so. And then I'm trying to work on some pieces that aren't journalism and I want to write about human nature somehow, and I would like to learn about psychology and other things, and because I feel like in some ways I've taken it as far as it can go in that whole man's inhumanity to man bit. So as far as journalism goes, and as far as a historical approach goes, now I'm kind of interested in the same thing, but from a biological perspective and from a psychological perspective, stuff I hadn't considered before. But I'm trying to educate myself about it. And I don't know if I can really make that into a work of comics, but I'll give it a shot. In the back there.
So your character does not have eyes. Was that intentional?
It was intentional, but I feel like it was such a cheap sort of idea in a way. I mean, the idea was the eyes are the window on the soul. And I think, well, the reader's going to get this part of me, but not the full thing. And so then it becomes your character, and you don't even think about it anymore, frankly. It meant something when I did it. I had an idea in mind. Now it seems slightly, I won't say trite, but it's just as well. Sometimes I don't want to show as much emotion with the eyes. So it's just as well that I've learned how to show emotion with my lips, I guess. So anyone else? Yes?
I'm just curious, if you're in Palestine or even in Palestine, when you're out interviewing, do you present yourself as a journalist?
The question is, do I present myself as a journalist or as a cartoonist, and how do people react? As I mentioned to the class earlier today, at first I was very self-conscious about what I was doing and not even sure of what I was doing. So I would tell people I was working on a project or a journalism project. So I got around it that way because I wasn't sure how people would react. Later, I began to understand that one of the national heroes is Najla Ali, and he's a great heroic cartoonist of the Palestinians. So when I did bring it up, his name always came up, and people sort of smiled and said, "Oh yeah, we had this great cartoonist," and blah 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 blah. And one thing led to another, and it was a bit easier. Now, in contrast to that, the last time I was in the Palestinian areas in Gaza, I took the book Palestine with me, and my guide would give it to the person we were about to interview so he or she could look through it to get an idea of what I was doing. Because when they opened the book, they understood it. They saw, it wasn't prose, it wasn't a bunch of English language words they couldn't read, it was images that they got right away. And they got what I was doing, and then when I was asking, because I ask a lot of visual questions, they understood, oh, that's why he's asking it. And they would make their descriptions more apt for someone who's going to be drawing. So it helped. And then there are other places, because of Google, people know who you are, and they treat you, oh, you're a cartoonist, what are you doing it this way? But most, people have sort of given in to the notion. I think if you can show a level of seriousness as a journalist, no one minds if you're a cartoonist. And I never had a problem with other journalists. Was there another question over here? Yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering if your work had ever been translated, or like the people that you interview ever see the finished book, or have you ever like sent a copy to someone that was crucial to a certain book and their reaction to it?
Right. I mean, I always worry about how people are going to react, who are especially the main characters. The people in Garage all got, the main characters in the Garage book all got copies of the book. And I sent, it's hard to get books into Gaza, but at the moment. But some have gotten in from people who've been able to cross over. And probably, as far as I know, there's about 6 or 7 copies there that have circulated around, But who knows how many have gotten in there. I do want the people to see the stuff, if possible. And my work has been translated into a fair number of languages, most of the European languages. And the Bosnian book has been translated into Bosnian or Serbo-Croat. And yeah, sometimes it surprises me who's translating my book, but the stuff's gotten around. Yes?
I'm wondering if you object to that genre being called a comic book. I spent some time in Bosnia, and like you, I didn't find anything really comical. So I wonder if you always describe yourself as a cartoonist rather than a comic book artist?
I think of myself as a cartoonist, but I personally have no problem at all with the expression comic book or comic book artist. In fact, I kind of like it. I grew up with it, and it just doesn't have the connotation it might have for some people who think of it as only about, Mickey Mouse or Superman. I understand how people see that, but I don't like some of the modern terminology like graphic novel so much. I'll use it myself because people understand it, but I think of it as sort of a marketing way of making adults feel good about buying a comic book. I don't have any problem with it. I mean, it's like there are certain words that I know comic means something like comedy on some level. You think of it in those terms, but to me there are certain words that just mean something else. They've just taken on another meaning, and I don't even think of that connotation. And my work, I've done humorous work, but my work is generally pretty serious. But there's always humor in those books because there's a lot of black humor. There was a lot of black humor in Bosnia and a lot of black humor among the Palestinians. So I stand out of the way of that, and if something's funny, it's funny. And I want people to see that there's humor even when things look really bleak.
Could you cite something that happened to you in Bosnia that was funny?
Ooh. Okay, it's in the book. It's not really funny. It's really black humor. All right. The major cigarette, in Sarajevo, there were only 3 factories that were open through the entirety of the war. One of them was a cigarette factory. And the national cigarette of Bosnia is the Drina. So Gorazda was sitting on the Drina River. It was the last place in Bosnia that was government territory that still was held on the Drina River. And people in Gorazda were very worried about their fate. They thought they were going to suffer the fate of the people in Srebrenica or Žepa, be expelled or the males killed. They were very worried about that. But I sort of joked with them that if the town fell, Bosnia would have to change the name of its cigarette, because there'd be nothing left on the Drina. So, I mean, that's sort of the black humor. I mean, not really funny, but definitely black humor. Anyone else? Yes.
Obviously, this is a question coming from someone who's immersed in the cartooning community, but I wanted to know, do you always travel by yourself, and what it's like to not really have anyone to bounce your ideas off of if you don't, or if that's beneficial or, you know, difficult, you know, not getting a biased opinion from anyone?
The only time I've ever traveled to a place with someone was when I went to Ingushetia, to do the Chechen story, to go to the refugee camps for Chechens. And that was with the woman who basically funded it. It was an actress. And she was young and really interesting and really just full of, she couldn't wait to get out there and do the story. And it was kind of fun being around her. But generally speaking, I really prefer to travel alone. And I often have a very good relationship with my translator guide. They're often not professional fixers. They're usually local people who know the community, who are trusted within the community. And I'm always bouncing stuff off them. In fact, in Footnotes in Gaza, Abed, who was my translator and guide, he was basically a bullshit barometer with a lot of things. I mean, he would be translating a story, and then he'd lean over and say, I don't really believe this guy. Or I think he's exaggerating. Now, he's Palestinian. He had maybe every reason to sort of let it go the way it goes in an exaggerated way, but he got really behind what I was trying to do. And to him, it was clear that the truth mattered, not an exaggeration, but what actually happened. So he would be a filter for me, another filter. And I really respected his opinion. And my base rule was, if he doesn't think it was, there were times I said, I kind of believe that guy. And he goes, I don't. He was a veto. And so the story wouldn't make it in. So yeah, I mean, people like that who know things I don't know, and whom I trust, I definitely want to bounce things off them. Anyone else? Yes?
At times in Palestine, you seem pretty afraid and uncomfortable with the whole situation, that you're in an area of conflict and you don't really know how to act. Do you ever get used to being in a new culture where you don't know like how things happen or what's going to happen? Do you ever get used to that uncomfortableness?
Just before I was definitely uncomfortable in that book, and it really shows in the way I depict myself and not knowing what I was doing or even what I was seeing sometimes. Over time, you learn to handle yourself in a more professional way. You're not as worried about some things. And that's actually, to be honest, it's sort of a dangerous moment where you feel like you know what's going on. I mean, any journalist will tell you the moment you think you know what's going on, that's when something can happen. So I'm always pretty careful. I'm always in situations when I don't know how to act. Now, in Gaza, I sort of did know how to act because I'd spent enough time among the Palestinians. In most cases, I knew how to act in certain situations. When I went to India, there were all kinds of cultural things that I didn't understand that you learn very quickly. You have a guide with you and someone saying, no, don't do that. You know, or in the Arab world, don't cross your legs and show the sole of your shoe. We all know what shoes represent now in the Arab world because they were hurled at dictators and Bush. So, you know, you learn things along the way. Never entirely comfortable, and that's I think one of the advantages of showing yourself as someone there. I mean, I'm always an outsider in those places, and I can't pretend otherwise. Okay, yeah, anyone else? Yeah, Josh.
So, if you had funding from whatever magazine would pay for you, and the situation was good, do you still kind of prefer to embark on a long book project, or would you just prefer to do the shorter pieces wherever they would be?
To me, a short book project now would be about a year or 2 years. If I felt I could get a book in a year or 2 years, I'd think about it. Yeah, I would. But I think I definitely want to sort of focus on something and not let it become a sprawling work, if at all possible. So, yeah, I'm still willing to do that length of journalistic book. But it have to be the right project. And maybe this project about America, which is a place I'm finding I know very little about. And I'm in West Virginia. I don't know how to act among West Virginians. I mean, there's definitely, they have their own culture, and there's a way you have to deal with people. And so you still learn a lot. And I mean, the great joy of being a journalist is being able to see these places. I mean, we were talking about this. It's the ultimate privilege. You get to see high and low. It's like a passport up and down the stratum. So anyway, that's it. So very nice talking to you.